It's hard to believe, but the Lord of the Rings movies just turned 20. I absolutely love these movies and thought it would be fun to do something to celebrate. So I found this scene here with Frodo standing on the shore looking down at this handsome guy in the water with the glowing eyes, and thought it would make a great diorama. So that's what I made this week. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. I started off this build on Nomad Sculpt for the iPad. I sculpted the face of the elf ghost as seen in the two towers in the dead marshes. I made sure to hollow out the eyes and the head so that later on I could add an LED to the back of the head and get those eyes to glow. I printed off the head and a 1:12 scale body that I could clothe and put armor on myself. I used this fabric from an old black t-shirt, and before I put anything on, I made sure to run some wires through a hole in the neck to wire up the eyes later. I inadvertently created Kylo Ren for a second before adding the rest of the fabric to everywhere that was not covered by armor. The armor itself I made with green stuff, which is a 2-part epoxy putty. After a couple hours, it cures nice and hard, and I went with this instead of clay because air dry would have taken a little too long for the time that I had, and oven bake would have ruined the resin figure underneath. So it worked out perfectly. I cut the green stuff into little strips to make the armor. The idea behind elven armor is that it's supposed to look natural and leaf-like. Mine was a little sloppy, so I think it ended up looking more like a braided loaf of bread. But all the little details get lost in the murky water anyways, so I'm not too worried about it. I added a little waistband and a cape with some straps that come over the shoulders. And then it was time to move on to the face. I gave it a ghostly white base coat, and then I used some Nuln Oil to give it a little bit of shading. I then hot glued an LED to the back of the inside of the head, and I glued the back of the head to the front of the head, and it was time to add the hair. This took me to a part of the hobby store I don't often go to, also took me to a part of YouTube I don't often go to, but I discovered a great tutorial on how to add realistic hair to 1:12 scale figures from Angie Og. I will link that below. And I know I could have done a better job putting this hair on. It was my first time. But I must have done a good enough job because this little ghost here got a call from an ad agency. I then took the armor outside and I primed it black before painting it with a greenish gold. I painted the hands white, and then once the elf was painted, I snipped the wires at the neck and I soldered the head on. Once I had glued that in place, it was time to move on to the base. For the base, I'm using some XPS Foam. The figure of the elf is 6 inches long, so I added an extra 4 inches to be able to fit the shore. And to get some nice clean cuts, I broke out the hot wire table, and I cut out a rectangle that was 6 by 10 inches. I knew I wanted to have a bank on one side of the base, with a slight overhang so that the feet of the elf could stick underneath, getting him a little bit closer to shore without having to cut his feet off, just in case they were visible. They ended up not being visible, so it didn't really matter. I shaped the bank with a utility knife, and while I was working with the foam, I used a respirator. It is not good at all to inhale any of the dust or fumes created from working with this stuff. I used a blowtorch to add a little bit more of a natural texture to the surface of the foam, and it was time to cover it with a terrain paste. The paste consists of plaster of Paris, Mod Podge, paint, and 1 or 2 splashes of water. I usually start the schmear with a palette knife, and then it ends up switching to the gloved hand schmear, which tends to do a better job. After I had left that to dry, I put some sand texture up on the bank. This step ended up being unnecessary. I thought some of it would show through after I had put the greenery and lichen on top, but none of it did, so it was kind of pointless, but that's okay. I got out my collection of hobby foliage materials and used various colors of lichen and moss to build up the marshy surface of the bank.
He's led us into a swamp.
I then broke out the various colors of long grass that I had available, and I made some tufts and bushes. Once that was done, I painted the rest of the base with black 3.0. I wanted the bottom underneath the resin to disappear and add the illusion of depth, and the black 3.0 worked perfectly for that. I then poked a hole through the bottom of the diorama to allow the wires to pass through, and I sealed it up with hot glue after the wires were through so that I didn't have resin leaking all over the table. I then cut and glued the acrylic sheets to the side of the diorama to help contain the resin while it was curing. And I sealed up all of the corners with a lot of hot glue to make sure that there were no leaks. Then it was time to mix up the resin. I followed the instructions as one should when using resin. 2 parts resin to 1 part hardener. I mixed in an opaque white pigment to boost the opacity. I didn't want to be able to see the bottom of this thing if possible. I mixed in a very generous amount of black and brown pigment as well to get that nasty swamp water color. I poured it into the mold. I popped the bubbles as they formed with a butane torch. I also added some lichen to the resin itself, and I left it to cure. Then it was time to work on Frodo. I actually made Frodo from 2 different files that I found online. The clothing and the body I got from a Mary file. I will link that below. The Frodo head I got from a bust that did not come with a full body. I will also link that below. I cut off Frodo's head and I added a new stem that fit with the Mary body. And I know that the clothes aren't perfect, but for the time that I had, it seemed like my best option. I was asked recently why sometimes I choose to sculpt my own 3D models, while other times I use other people's. The answer is usually because of time constraints. I try to get a video out each week if possible, and I often don't have enough time to model highly detailed or complicated models. So if I can find a high quality file online, I love to be able to support an artist and use their file, especially if it allows me to use my limited time more efficiently. Once I had finished painting Frodo's face and hair, I assembled him, and that was Frodo done. Unfortunately, during the curing process, some bubbles formed that I tried to fix, and then I messed up the nice surface of the resin. So I needed to fix that, but first I needed to remove it from the acrylic. I got a great tip recently that if you use isopropyl alcohol on hot glue, it peels off a lot easier. Unfortunately, I did rip off some of the paint from the foam, so it looks a little ugly right now, but I will fix that later. To get rid of the imperfections on the resin, I used an orbital sander, starting with a coarse grit, working my way up to a finer one, until I had returned it to a nice, smooth surface. I then sprayed on a gloss clear coat to get it nice and shiny again. I glued some black acrylic to the sides to clean it up, and the very last thing to do was to put Frodo in place. After that, I called it good. that is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Do yourself a favor and go watch The Lord of the Rings, at least the Fellowship of the Ring, if not all three, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of these awesome films. Thank you to all of my patrons for your continued support of this channel. I appreciate you all very much. Have an awesome week, everyone. I will see you next time.